Lord God, I thank you for this opportunity to speak your word, and I just pray that you would be with me and with the congregation. Let us give ourselves over to you for this next time. And I pray that you'd speak through me, and I pray that you'd give me something to say that's worth hearing. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, so as you may have gathered, I'm not the normal guy. And so what that means that now I'm in charge for the next... We'll see how long we can make this go. So if you're new, please come back next week after, or the week after I've spoken. Don't give up. And if you're not new, then also please come back next week. Hopefully I don't lose you all. I have to say, I was not really excited about the topic, which is here. This is what Alan gave me. He said, hey, I'd love for you to preach on the social media meltdown. I thought, well, that's odd because I don't really use social media, so it's kind of like having someone who's deaf preach on noise pollution, or maybe because I'm sort of in one end of the spectrum, maybe it's like having someone who's in the oil and gas industry preach on environmental regulations or something. It's just going to be one perspective. But I did think about it a lot, and I talked to several people, younger people, and I realized that social media is actually something that I interact with quite a lot, as it turns out, and I think it's definitely worth a conversation and worth a topic. So I struggled. I got out, I actually left it on the dining room table. I thought it would be a good visual aid, but when you prepare a sermon, I tend to do much better with expository preaching, where you take some Bible piece and you kind of tear it apart and you go into it. And so I got my Wayne Grudem systematic theology out, and you go in the back and you look in the index, it's about this thick. You look up Twitter and there's nothing. You're just kind of on your own. And so this will be kind of a challenge, but I'll do my best to bring a Christian perspective to this. And so I think we can probably cover this in, 30 seconds. We go to the next slide. Not a whole lot more to say about this, right? I think we can just kind of agree. We can all get out early today. But that's not fair, and it's not true. So let's try that again. The next slide. Not quite so much. There are good things and there are bad things about social media, and I'm going to cover them both, and I'm going to start with good things, because we always like to start on the positive note. Social media, social media gives us the opportunity to do something we've never been able to do before, opportunities we've never had. Now you may say, well, wait a minute. Weren't there social media in your day and age, my day and age, when I was a youth? Wasn't there something called social media in your day? Didn't we just, aren't we just have new stuff now? There's always been social media. And that's kind of true, and so I'll go through a little bit of that, just to sort of ground what we're talking in. Social media has been around for a long, long time. It starts back probably about 2,500 years ago with King Cyrus of Persia, who decreed that, there's another slide. Thank you. Nope, keep going. There we go. Who decreed that there should be a way for people in his kingdom to get packages to each other everywhere. And not only that, but he also decided that we should enter into partnerships or treaties with other nations, and so that we could actually send mail around the whole Middle East. So that was the first guy. The first time that the average person had been able to reach out and actually send something to someone else, 2,500 years ago. That stayed pretty much the same for the next, back. Okay, we'll stop there. About 2,000 years later, we got Gutenberg's printing press, and so it took 2,000 years to kind of improve upon mail. And then about 400 years after that, we got the telegraph, and then 40 years after that, we got the telephone in 1876. Nope, not done yet. I'll call for it. That's good. So this was our social media. This was my social media growing up. Now notice, the social media that I had growing up when I was in high school was already over 100 years old. Like this was the height of the technology then, and that's actually what the phone looked like. Mine was beige, but same idea. Had the little rotary dial. You dialed with sparks by pulling your finger around the dial. And if you had a lot of nines in your phone number, it was really bad because it took forever to dial the phone number. There was this cord, and I had a little video, but I couldn't really get it to work, but of someone being yanked off their feet by a phone cord. So you were always constrained by walking around with these cords. The most interesting thing is that there was one phone in the house. There might be actually more than one phones, but there was one phone line in the house. And that's if you didn't have a party line, where there were multiple houses on the same line. And what that meant was that it's hard to describe to the current generation what it would mean to have one phone in the house. And it's kind of like, I was trying to like a television, no, it's kind of like the refrigerator. So imagine you've got a refrigerator, but you can't open the refrigerator if someone else in your house is eating or drinking anything. And so you come home from work and you're at school and you're really hungry, and you come in and there's someone sitting at the table and they're starting to eat, and you're like, oh, when will you be done? Oh, well, we just started, I don't know, half an hour, I don't know. And you just gotta wait. So the phone was interesting. If you had someone call you and you were on the phone, there was no voicemail, there wasn't even call waiting, you'd get a busy signal. And not only would you get a busy signal and be like, well, I guess I'm just not going to talk to them today, but the person who you were calling never got a notice that you had actually tried to reach out to them. It was very, very it was very frustrating. So this is what we had. And the last thing, of course, is that there being one phone in the house, that meant that if I wanted to, if there was someone I liked, let's say Mary, and I wanted to chat with her, I'd have to call her house at like 9 o'clock. And no doubt her father was going to answer and say, yes, sir, is Mary around? And it's 9 o'clock, and you'd go through this whole, I have a question about my math homework. All right, well, I'll give you 5 minutes. It was a very, very awkward thing. And by the way, when the phone rang, you were always afraid people were asleep because there was actually a bell in here. It wasn't sort of this warble. It was a literal bell that clanged, and it was designed specifically to get your attention from another room. So it was very, very loud. So anyway, this was the social media technology that I had to avail myself of. But it's true, we had our own social media technology. All right, next slide. Moving on, then we had the Apple II computer, and then we actually had email coming around 1983. That was a big deal. I remember I went to a training class in college to learn to use email. I got a t-shirt that said I survived Athena Survival. It was a big deal. And then that was kind of, who do I send email to? Because the only people who have email are my friends here in the college. So that went on until, next slide, something happened in the 90s where we had the World Wide Web start, and then AOL brought everyone onto the internet. That was a big deal. I'll talk more about that later. Finally, we're where we are now, which is this explosion of these new technologies that allow us to communicate very quickly and easily with each other. And notice that most of these have happened in the last 10 years or so. So these are all kind of new compared to the 100 years that I had to wait to get something better than a telephone. We've got these things coming out every year. So back to the slide of these opportunities that we never had. So yes, we had opportunities we never had. We had the opportunity to interact in real time with people who are far away. Not like in the telephone, but in a very, very different way. So, we can reach people that we couldn't reach before. One way that's important is that there's this thing called real-time reporting of events. So if we're in Syria and we see the government shelling some hamlet, we can actually talk about it. We can tweet about it, we can report on it on Facebook, we can stream it. And it's hard for people to actually pretend that it didn't happen then. So instead, it makes it much more difficult for people to control the news. So that's a really good thing. Very difficult to suppress. Other opportunities we have are to reach people we couldn't effectively reach. My generation they say is going to be the only generation to go through this experience of losing touch of a lot of people when you graduate from high school and all of a sudden finding them again many, many years later. Current generations graduating from high school and college do not have to face that. You never have to lose track of people that you don't want to. I actually just 2 weeks ago had a conversation with a friend of mine from high school whom I had not spoken to in 18 years. And that was because there was a death in the family, and we ended up getting in contact because of that. But that kind of thing is not going to happen in this generation. So you can reach people that you couldn't reach before, and you can stay in contact with people that you do know. So my wife and I met. We went to dinner for the first time together. It was a great dinner. And then I left for sea about 2 or 3 weeks later. I was in the Navy, and I left, and I was deployed for about 7 months in the middle of the ocean on a ship with 5,000 of my closest friends. And there was no way, there's no phone, there's no email, there's no Instagram or chat or nothing of it. So what there was letters. And there's a great story about how we use letters and tapes and all the rest of this stuff. But that's not something that can happen. When I went back to the Navy as a reservist years later, There's email. My wife and I are chatting all the time. It's a completely different experience. So these are all good things. Opportunities we've never had. We can not only stay in contact with people we know, but we can put people into the moment, into our moments specifically. That is, I was on a trip recently, a year ago, and I got this it was called a German baby. It was my breakfast. And I thought, well, that's really odd. I took a photograph of it, and I sent it to a German man that I know. And I said, do you know what this is? And I was like, oh, sure, it's a German baby. You can actually pull people into your lives in a real and immediate way, which is kind of cool. You can get an instant response. And this is actually more important than you think. And I talked about, you call someone, you get a busy signal, you can't talk to them, and things are a little different. So I know someone who was going through a very difficult time some years ago, and they decided they wanted to do something drastic and permanent to fix their situation. And so they made their plans, and they did. And they took their actions. And then they went onto social media to a group where no one actually knew each other in real life, but they told people what they had done, or they sent that out into the void. As it turns out, and this is very much God working through the world, there was someone up at that time who saw the message and realized that though no one had ever met in real life, they actually knew someone in common with this person. And I'm not going to go through the whole chain of events, but there were some email messages, there were some phone calls, there were some people who had phone numbers handy, and within literally minutes of that action being taken, there were people in real life intervening. And within minutes after that, that person was in a hospital, and because of this, their life was forever changed. The story doesn't actually end there. As it turns out, some years after that, that same person was in a social media session, and someone else was telling them that they were looking at doing something drastic and permanent. And that person was able to reach out to them and in real time and spend time with them, talking to them, chatting with them, basically talking them off the ledge. This ability to communicate with people, and so social media has, in this case, altered, if not preserved, 2 lives. So the ability to reach out to people that you don't know and have an immediate interaction can be an incredibly positive thing, which God can use in incredible ways, which in this case he did. I do not want to ever say that social media is a bad thing, and you shouldn't either. These things could not have happened otherwise. There are people who would not be alive today, but for their relationships with social media. There are people whose lives would be forever changed. It cuts the other way as well, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But there is the possibility and the potential to do enormous good with social media. I don't want to lose track of that. So there are good things. There are also bad things. So let's go back to that first slide. There are opportunities we never had before to interact in real time with people who are far away, one-on-one or in person. Nope, can you keep going? One more slide. There we go. But here's the thing. You don't have to be accountable to them. You don't have to know who they are. You don't have to understand them. You don't have to be able to evaluate them. So next slide. This is all done in a vacuum. Can all be done in a place where you don't have any idea who people are. So it makes it kind of easy to behave badly or to be taken advantage of. And so there are some major issues I want to talk about with social media. And in no particular order, and I tried to order these, but I kept changing it around, so we get what we get. The issues that I want to talk about today are time, the echo chamber effect, toxicity, anonymity, what I'm going to call our Achilles heel, and then isolation. These are very real things that we need to be paying attention to and wary of with social media. So we're going to start with time. Time is the one thing that people can't buy. When you've used it, it's over. When your life is done, it's done. You don't get more. Well, Christians believe you do, but even Christians believe you don't get more here. It's the rope analogy that Alan was using later. You have this opportunity here on earth to do what God has put in front of you. Speaking for myself, I waste most of it. I suspect most of us do. I'd like to say that I spend my time when I can deepening my relationship with God, focusing on that. I don't. I get home from work and I'm tired and I'll watch television. I'll talk with my wife, which is quite valuable. Or I'll maybe do some math puzzle or something and try and keep myself interested. Do I read the Bible every night? No, absolutely not. Next slide. Rick Warren says, here's how you know it's really important to people. Look at their calendar and look at their bank statements. Basically, where people are spending their time, that's what they're interested in. So, if you find yourself spending a lot of time on social media, I would say that is what's important to you. I know someone who spends 3 or 4 hours and who will happily tell me that they spend 3 to 4 hours a night reading political blogs. That is what they're interested in. Where you put your time is where your true interests lie. You should think about where you want your true interests to lie. So we'll go to the next slide. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you, not harm you, plans to give you hope in the future. God has a plan for you. He has things he wants you to do. And I'm not saying that he never wants you to look at a cat video, but I am saying that he has a broader plan. No, I'm serious. I'm not. Humor's good, it's all great. But he has a plan for us. He has things he wants us to do. And then we say, now today or tomorrow I'm going to do this here. We do not even know what's going to happen tomorrow. Where's your life? You are a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes. We need to take advantage of the time that God has given us. Because we can't get any more of it. The next slide, please. They say that no one ever dies wishing that they spent more time at work. I think it's also true, I don't mean to be glib here, but I think it's probably true that no one's going to die thinking, on their deathbed, if I only could see one more ultimate fail video, I could go peacefully. It'll be great, it's all, I'm laughing too, but it's true. We tend to fritter away our time in dissipation. The question is, how much of my time am I willing to spend, my short period on earth, catching up on news about people I've never even met or not going to meet? So, time. Let's talk about the echo chamber and the echo chamber effect. So an echo chamber, of course, is when you surround yourself with people who are just telling you what you already want to hear or what you've already said yourself. So I believe this. So next slide, please. So I believe this thing, so I'm going to go to a website or a chat forum or something where people are going to agree with me, and we're just going to talk all day long about these things. So actually, I asked the person who spends 3 to 4 days or 3 to 4 hours a day in political blogs, well, wow, that's a lot of time. So do you read all of different blogs, different sites, and they are very much at one end of the political spectrum. And I said, do you go to the other end of the political? And their answer was, oh God, no. Yeah, I get all of that during the day. This is, I spend that time really focused on, my tribe, my people. Okay, so that's an echo chamber. If you go online, you can find people who will agree with you about pretty much whatever you say. So there's a lot of Bible verses about counsel. Let me go to the next slide, please. I'm not even going to read all these. I'm going to try, but I'll just read a couple. Where there's no guidance, people fall, but in abundance of counselors there's victory. The way of the fool is right in his own eyes, but the wise man is he who listens to counsel. I love this one. A fool takes no pleasure in understanding, but only in expressing his opinion. This really strikes me as pretty apropos to what we're talking about. I want to say something very clear. When God's talking about getting counsel, and people will say, well, I get counsel. I spend 4 hours a day on political sites. I get counsel all the time. I talk with people all the time. Next slide. God is not talking about finding people who agree with you. That is not called counsel. That is called affirmation. I can find people who agree with everything I say, or at least most of the things I say, and we can talk about how right I am and how right they are all day long, and that is not counsel. Counsel is finding someone who is ideally smarter and wiser than you, but at least as smart and as wise as you are, and who will challenge you with thoughts that you haven't had and make you consider, well, maybe I should think about this a different way. That is counsel. In the Bible, next slide, the Bible, when it's talking about seeking out counsel, it's not talking about affirmation. It is saying, find counsel. Counsel leads to understanding. which leads to wisdom. Proverbs says, though it costs you all you have, get understanding. So, I want to be clear. Echo chambers are not counsel. Echo chambers are self-gratification. Okay. We'll move on to toxicity. And I don't know, there is so much to say on toxicity. I struggled very hard with this. What do you say? Why is it that so much of social media seems to be toxic? There's a lot of theories on this. Someone has said to me that social media is really useful when you're far apart for keeping you in touch. When you get closer, it becomes more problematic. That is, people start using social media in a different way when they're not communicating over a distance. Words are cheaper in social media, and I think it's interesting when you think about Twitter, which was introduced, well, it was built in like 2006. It was actually introduced widely at South by Southwest in 2007, and the usage in that week tripled. Because all of a sudden, and what they were promoting it as was a way of keeping in touch and collaborating with people. So you're at South by Southwest, and you maybe there with 6 people, and you all get on you all follow each other, and one of you can say, hey, I'm hankering for some Chinese, and there's a P.F. Chang's a block away from the convention center. How about we meet there at 6? And someone else can reply and say, oh, well, I'm in a session until 6:30. Can we meet at 6:35 or 6:40? And you can have this session and really collaborate very efficiently with each other. That's what it was designed for. What it has turned into over the last 10 years, is something very, very different and very, very toxic often. And I had a slide up there where I had all these tweets about, but we all know what they are. And I don't mean to, people look at tweets and say, oh, I know who tweeted that. That's not fair. So I don't even want to get into that. But I think we can all agree that social media, and specifically Twitter and real-time interactions, have become very, very toxic. Go to the next slide. Well, God has some very specific opinions on toxicity and dealing with people and speaking to people. The ones that cause me pause. I tell you, on the day of judgment, people will give account for every careless word they speak. Well, that's not a day I'm looking forward to. I've spoken some careless words in my life. The internet has made that truer than ever. We don't even have to wait for the day of judgment. So Harvard University just rescinded the acceptance of Kyle Kashuv, who was one of the survivors of the Parkland shooting in Florida, and who then went on and applied to Harvard, and he became a sort of speaker about gun violence, and applied to Harvard and got in until some tweets that he had posted in the past, 4 years earlier, popped up, and people started sending him to Harvard saying, this is the person you just admitted, and Harvard rescinded his resignation, or his acceptance. The things you say matter, and they last. They've always mattered, and they've always lasted to God. Now they matter and they last to people here on earth. And I think that's important to remember. You've heard this is from Jesus speaking. Do not murder. Anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. But if anyone who says, you fool, will be subject to the fire of hell. That is, God considers character assassination just as bad as murder. I've tried to teach my kids, and I think I have. You say things to your friends or your parents, and you can't really unsay them. You may say something in anger, and then later say, oh, I didn't mean it, and you didn't, and they know you didn't, and that's all fine, but you still said it. And there's still that memory of them hearing it. And that can be difficult. So, toxicity. Again, I'm just going to move on from that to anonymity. So why are people toxic? Well, I think one of the reasons is the ability to be anonymous. And I don't mean, the next slide, I don't mean literally anonymous, because sometimes you are, and sometimes you're not. So it can be literal or figurative. There's a certain sense of anonymity that is granted to you by being far apart from someone. So someone may have my name, but that doesn't really help them if they're in China, or for that matter, if they are in Rhode Island. I'm just a name to them. I can say things to them without fear of reprisal, without fear of them showing up on my doorstep, typically. And it gives me a freedom that I don't normally have. I don't know who's at the other end. And so I can say things that I would never say in real life. It also gives an opportunity for people to deceive. I can deceive. I can pretend to be someone I'm not. People can deceive me. It's kind of like, and this isn't my line, so I'll give this, I don't want to take credit for this, but it's kind of like standing on a stage and with the lights in your eyes, and you can't see who you're talking to, you're just saying things, and it's kind of like you're throwing things into a void. Only it's not a void. There are actually people there being hurt by what you're saying, and you just can't see them. So this sort of anonymity gives you the ability, or the ability to do these things without not only fear of reprisal, but without sort of fear of without fear of self-correction. You don't have to worry about hurting people because you don't see it happen. Next slide. Let's move on from that. So there's this whole idea of acting anonymously. You're protected from exposure, but acting in secret isn't protecting you. The fact that you can say something without fear of being caught up by the person you're going to hurt is not really the issue. It's not even that you are hurting them. It's that you're hurting yourself. And C.S. Lewis talks about, it's hard to read, but therefore what really matters is these little marks or twists on the central inside part of your soul. These are the things that you do that corrupt your spirit, that slowly turn you into a different person. And these happen whether you are facing your opponent or not. Doesn't matter if they can come back at you. It doesn't matter if you see them. It is what you are doing that impacts you. And this kind of goes into the next piece. I'm going to go on to the next part, which is our Achilles heel. So why is this important? I'm going to go back to C.S. Lewis. Next slide. And I'm just going to read this. It's a little quiz. So there is one vice of which no man in the world is free, which everyone in the world loathes when he sees it in someone else, and of which hardly any people ever imagine that they are guilty themselves. I've heard people admit that they are bad-tempered, or that they cannot keep their heads about girls or drink, or even that they are cowards. I do not think I have ever heard anyone accuse himself of this vice. And at the same time, I have very seldom met anyone who has showed the slightest mercy to it in others. There is no fault which makes a man more unpopular, and no fault which we are more unconscious of in ourselves. And the more we have of it in ourselves, the more we dislike it in others. So what's he talking about? Anyone? Pride. Thank you. Next slide. He is talking about pride, which he calls the great sin. It was Satan's sin. It was the sin that made Satan fall. Satan wanting to set himself equal to God. Everyone has it. Everyone hates it. And pride has no friends. By that I mean, if I'm a drunkard, I may enjoy hanging out with other drunkards and drinking. If I'm a gambler, I may go on gambling trips. You can go through any sin that I may have. And typically you can find pleasure in doing it with other people who are of the same ilk. A prideful man does not want to be around another prideful man. It is a solitary, lonely sin. Because it is a sin fundamentally of competition. That is the need to be better than others. And if there is someone else who also needs to be better than others, that means they need to be better than you, and you are in competition. So pride is this terrible sin that we all suffer from. We all tend to deny it, and yet we all have it. We want to tear down others, and we want to puff ourselves up. Next slide. So social media is the proud person's utopia. It is almost custom designed to feed our pride. We can count our followers, we can count our friends, we can count our likes, we can see how we stack up to against other people. We have the opportunity to actually even turn that into money if we want. Next slide. The more followers you have, the more you need to get their attention. And the more you need to get their attention, the more radical things you need to do. And again, remember, you are not in a place where you are going to be held accountable for the things you do. So you can attack those you perceive as threats to our primacy. So if someone looks like they're getting more more followers than I am, we can attack them and build myself up. And we are encouraged to do outrageous things to draw attention to ourselves. So social media is a great little cauldron for promoting this in ourselves. Next slide. The other thing is that when I talked about people, echo chambers, well, in social media, it is really easy to find an echo chamber. If I were to stand on the streets of Pflugerville and talk about how I hate people from Rhode Island, people would give me kind of an odd look and probably walk on by and call me crazy. There might be, someone who had a bad experience in Rhode Island. Maybe they wouldn't let them in the state because it was full or something, and so they'll honk at me and say, yeah, go. That's about it. I go online. I can find people who hate Rhode Island just as much as I do, and we can talk about that all day long. So there is a perfect little incubator for my hatred. Even my basest thoughts can find people who I can find people who share my basest thoughts. So, next slide. Social media teaches us very explicitly to want more followers, to crave more attention, to want to compete with others, to want to tear down others, and to want to value our own worst tendencies. There's very little to gain by doing the right thing. So how often have you seen a Twitter feud that has ended in, hey, you know what? Let's stop dragging everyone else through the mud. Let's take this offline. We'll have a conversation and just hash this out. That's not the point. The whole point is to do this publicly, to shame people publicly. And again, this is designed almost purposely, it would seem, to feed our own pride. So let's move on. Lastly, isolation. Well, next slide. You can get pretty much anything you need online. And even in the company of others, social media encourages people to withdraw. I think all of us have been in a room in someone's presence while they've been texting. In fact, if you've been with me, you've probably seen me do that. It's a very natural thing to do. Just a sec, this is more important than you, because that's what I'm saying. Let me attend to this more important thing, and then I'll get back to you when I've got nothing better to do. People will say, we'll sit around a table, and they'll say, oh yeah, we're just sitting with the phones, we're kind of texting, we're doing our thing. No, but we're sharing, we're being together, it's okay. And yeah, I get it. But again, watching a cat video is no substitute for an actual conversation. And sharing with each other little tidbits that you find online as humorous items may be fine, but it is not the same thing as having a meaningful conversation about the world, life, God, love, your heart, your pain. These are the things that we need to take advantage of. I remember very specifically going to dinner with another couple, my wife and I, and we're at dinner at a restaurant where we're paying for food and effectively paying to spend time with these people, and both of them are sitting there on their cell phones texting with their kids throughout the entire meal. Just like, hang on, this is really important. Okay, all right. So it encourages us. In terms of isolation, social media encourages us, or certainly enables us, to step back from social interaction, from face-to-face interaction, and be more distant from each other. And you can say, oh, no, I had lunch with Bob. Oh, what did you talk about? Well, we didn't really talk. We kind of just had lunch in the same table. So, next slide. So I have some takeaways. There's good and bad about social media, and I want to not lose sight of that. Social media has the power and has transformed people's lives in amazing ways for the better. It has also destroyed people's lives and continues to do so. So, social media has changed how we interact with the world to an enormous degree, and there are huge benefits to its appropriate use. Next slide. It also provides us with an incredible temptation to turn inwards and focus on ourselves instead of focusing on the people around us, to feed our own sense of self-gratification, our pride. We have the opportunity to belittle, offend, or even just ignore others. And it certainly has the ability to exhaust our time. So, I'm going to talk about a few, and who am I to say? No one. I did go online, I've talked to people, I've said, okay, so what are some rules that you think are viable for social media? So I'm going to talk about some rules to live by. And again, you can take these for what you want. We had these little stickers we were going to give people. Alan said, hey, you might want to give these. It's you can fast from social media and say, hey, I haven't used social media for a week. And honestly, I don't know if that's the right answer. I'm not saying that everyone should fast. Come back to that in just a minute. But there are a couple rules. And the first is to remember that the internet is forever. Kai, who just got denied entrance into college because of something he did when he was 13, well, comes back to haunt him. I actually Googled myself when I was preparing for this, and I found a paper that I'd written in graduate school 25 years ago online. I had no idea. You have no idea how these things live on. So, when you type something, whether it's an instant message to a friend, which is going to show up at a college admissions office or a job opportunity. Oh, by the way, I've been reading resumes this week. We're hiring at my office. And yes, I absolutely go to their social media and see what they've said. Because honestly, if I want to see how someone reacts and how someone is going to behave in the workplace, why not go and look and see what they do and how they behave and react? And please don't tell me. And I've had HR people say, "Oh, you shouldn't do that." Well, that's ridiculous because they're going to show up in the office and do that. So yes, I absolutely want to know. So if you and I don't know what Brian's probably tearing his hair out in the back. Brian's an HR professional. I'm sorry. Okay, so Brian is an HR professional. He does this for a living, and yes, he goes to social media. Do not think that you can post a snarky comment about your friend and no one's ever going to see it again. It will live forever, and people will see it. Think about that before you post something. One of the things, well, I'll get to this in a minute. Okay, so remember the internet is forever. Rule number 2, don't isolate yourself. If you're talking to someone, talk to them. Actually set aside time to have real conversations. There are all these things you can do. So you put the answer to the dinner conversation texting thing is you put your phones in the center of the room and the first person to pick it up pays for dinner. Just try that that'll happen once or twice and then you won't do that again. But the point is, give yourself over to it. Give yourself over to your friend and say, it drives me crazy when I'm talking to someone and the phone rings and they look at the phone and, okay, I get they want to make sure it's not an emergency, that's fine. But someone says, oh, okay, I got to take this. Well, okay, I understand. It's more important than I am. And that, your kid could be in the hospital. It could be any one of a number of things. I hope that's what it is, because that's what you're telling someone when you suddenly prioritize the text message you just received that you have to respond to right now over the conversation you're having. So, don't isolate yourself. Be in the moment. There's a slide here. Right. So let us consider how we may spur one another on towards love and good deeds, not giving up meeting together, as some are in the habit of doing, but encouraging one another. So take this opportunity when you're with someone to actually encourage them and not just send them a cat video. Okay, next rule. Don't violate someone's privacy. This has nothing really to do with, well, there are some scripture verses I think I've got here. But honestly, keep in mind that the fact that you know something about someone does not mean that everyone else in the world is supposed to know someone about them. Please ask them if they want, next slide, ask them if they want, if it's okay if you share a photo with them. This, incidentally, by the way, one of the things I hate most about preaching, and so as an elder here, let me back up and say, I think it's very important that we be able to preach, that elders, the Bible says, elders must be able to preach the word of God. It's important. I really hate that there's going to be videos of me and photos of me and all the rest of the stuff on websites. Well, that's part of the cost. However, if you're with a friend and you take their photo, don't just post it. Ask them if that's okay. Again, it's a privacy thing. There are some scripture verses on that, which I didn't put in here, but there are things about not tearing down your neighbor. So I think we all get that. Next rule, don't live in an echo chamber. It's way too easy. Go looking for other points of view. If you're in a chat room and with people that you agree with, go to the other chat room and see what they're saying. Maybe it will help you understand where they're coming from, because as Jake so eloquently said, and it was actually part of my sermon, there is not a person on earth that God does not love. The people in that other chat room, God loves them deeply. Understand them. Very few people are born evil. They have a point of view, and sometimes you can actually see how they got to that point of view. You may still disagree, but it's important to understand. And if you don't even understand how they got to that point of view, well, at least you'll understand what their plan of attack is, and you can be ready for it. So just spend time with the other points of view. Next slide. And this is important. Don't pollute yourself. Go to the next slide, please. Choose your words carefully, and don't dishonor yourself or God. There's so much scripture here. I just picked one, which is, it is not what enters the mouth that defiles a man, but what proceeds out of the mouth that defiles the man. It is what you say that contaminates you. It is what you do. It is not what you eat or where you live or what you do for a living. It is how you act, what you speak, and what you do. When you talk to someone, what is your goal? Is your goal to make them look stupid, to make them feel stupid, to get more followers of your own, or is it to convince them of a different point of view? And if it's the latter, then you're probably not going to do well by insulting them. Talk to them, understand them, and try to I want to say meet them. There are people you can't meet with, that you're just too far apart from. It doesn't mean you can't try to understand where they are and you can't love them. Next slide. So these are classic. Finally, brothers and sisters, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, pure, lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things. Let that run through your head when you're about ready to post your blasting response to someone because they said they didn't like your photo or they don't like your political party. Is this admirable? Next slide, please. Don't let it steal your time. That's the last thing I'm going to say. Now I get to use my MacGuffin. This isn't my demo. Someone else showed me this, and it was arresting to me. Alan talked a few weeks ago about having a big, huge coil of rope, and people have just at the end, there's a little piece wrapped in tape, and they're really focused on that big, that little piece, and that is your life. That is how long you have compared to eternity, with or without God. And people are really, really wrapped up in just this little end of the rope. And that is true. We need to be focused on eternity. We need to be thinking about our future, our lives. And I would say that if you are a thinking person of any type, and you think that there is the smallest shred of a possibility that there is a God, or that, forget God, that there is an existence beyond this lifestyle, beyond this lifespan, that to not spend any time thinking seriously about that is an astonishing mistake. It's an illogical one. If you are not 100% certain that your life does not end when you pass away, I urge you to devote, an hour a week in church. Go to different churches. Go to different faiths. Read philosophy. Spend some time thinking about the future and what that might look like and what that would mean and how you would react to it. Because it is the big coil of rope that's important. However, we have been given a lifespan. It's not that long, so this is a yardstick. It's 36 inches. And if we consider that the average lifespan is about 80 years, then if you're 20 years old, that's gone, and you're here. And if you're 30 years old, that's gone, and now you're here. And if you're my age, this is what I've got left. I would encourage you to use your time wisely. And I'm not saying you can't watch a funny video. What I'm saying is you can't just watch funny videos. Please invest some time in thinking about the things that really might matter. like eternity. Because it's funny, I heard Bill Gates once say, church seems like a bad use of one's time. And I thought it was an astonishing thing for someone who is technically minded to say, because if eternity is true, then that's a division by zero. Then the time invested there has an infinite return, not zero. I don't have that much left in the big scheme of things. I may have much less, who knows? I'm hoping I can squeeze this out a little. But the point is, there is an end, and God knows when that is, and I don't. And I am not using my time very well if I am dissipating it, doing things that don't matter. So that would be my final charge to you. I hope that what has come out of this is, social media is with us. It is an incredibly powerful thing that has incredible advantages. I don't want to call the worship team back up, I'm sorry. It has some incredible advantages. It can dramatically improve people's lives. It allows them to report reality to people who otherwise wouldn't know what's going on in the world. It can let people intervene in their lives at critical moments. And it can destroy lives, and often does. And we need to be very careful about how we interact with social media and think about how God would like us to be interacting. Does he want us to be crushing that person online? Does he want us to be spending all of this time doing things that are not really that useful in the big scheme of things? Or does he want us to be using social media as a form of good in the world? So obviously, I think he would rather us do the latter. So again, I'm much more comfortable doing expository preaching, but I'm hoping that this was useful in some way. Thank you very much for listening.